if we're looking for fat loss, should we be doing high intensity interval training, some sort of, again, HIIT training, maybe on an assault bike, maybe on some sort of sprints, whatever it is, right? Or should we be doing low intensity work, right? Because obviously, the low intensity work, we have the potential there to burn quite a few calories, right? It's pretty decent. We could do that again, 2, 3, 4, 5 hours, right? But unfortunately, it also takes 2, 3, 4, 5 hours to burn a lot of calories. So if we work at higher intensities, potentially we could burn more calories in a shorter space of time, right? So is that all there is to this? Is that the only deciding factor between those two things? It's just a time commitment, or is there more to the discussion?
Yeah, so I mean, I do prescribe fat loss for the vast majority, or I do prescribe cardio for the vast majority of my fat loss clients. And typically that looks something like 1 to 2 interval sessions and a weekly target for their low intensity continuous work. So that might be like, I'm just happy for that to be flexible. So it could be something like, right, I want you to get 45 minutes in per week at 120 to 140 beats per minute, let's say, or 130 to 150 at a mode of activity that you enjoy. So it could be, or that you have access to. So it could be swimming, it could be cycling, running, whatever. Okay. And they might do that in one session, 45 minutes in one session. They might do 30 in one, 15 in another. They might do 3 by 15, etc. Ultimately, that's something I leave flexible. And then I would generally prescribe 1 to 2 interval sessions, which again will vary depending on the person's fitness more than anything, because interval training, especially hard interval training, where it's a genuine sprint at max effort on that whatever respective piece of equipment, it's very, very fatiguing. And ultimately, if we're using this as a supplement to the person's fat loss approach, we don't need to be, running the person totally into the ground with the cardio for the sake of energy expenditure. Now, generally, I'm looking at this from the perspective of cardio serving the purpose of improving fitness overall and also improving health. So I'm not just thinking about calorie burning, or very rarely am I thinking about that. So with regards to which you should do or which is better, I generally like a mix of both. I don't like too much interval training because it's very fatiguing. And if we're going to try to make a significant dent on energy expenditure across the week, like if we want to have 4 sessions, let's say, so that we're increasing energy expenditure on 4 days of the week, then I would be inclined to have a mix of the two. Because if you're just doing interval training and you're genuinely going, as I said, at a hard, high intensity, then it's going to be probably difficult to do productive weight training along with that to the same degree. So if you have, let's say, heavy squats and leg press and lunges, and then you're doing maximal effort, all out 20 to 30 second intervals on the assault bike, that's going to compromise your recovery from that weight training. So I probably would, reserve it for certain days and not every day of my cardio training. So generally slightly longer duration for the continuous and shorter duration for the intervals. Obviously the rest periods are baked in there. So it might be someone's doing 30 seconds on, 1 minute 30 off or something for their intervals if they're going quite hard. And they might do, I don't know, 5 to 10 rounds of that. Let's say, this overall session will be shorter despite those rest periods being in there. And yeah, I think a mix of the two is wise. And just remember that the goal is to run this alongside your weight training, and don't let it take over. Don't let it be the cause of you not recovering from your weight training or a cause of a decline in strength, because this is something we did discuss in the last podcast, where very often when people begin to lose strength in the gym, or their performance declines in the gym, it's not necessarily just the result of the deficit, but other things that might be occurring. So maybe their deficit is far too severe, or they've changed their training in favor of another goal that wouldn't necessarily just be strength. And in this case, what can happen is someone can get so focused on doing, let's say, more steps per day, like doing 20, 30,000 steps per day, or doing so much cardio, that now they're not recovering from their weight training. So remember the hierarchy of priorities there.
100%. And I would be very similar in how I approach this stuff, especially with the fat loss clients, just in general as well. Like, I do like people to have some sort of cardiovascular conditioning in their training programs. It does seem to make sense from all we know about health and fitness in general. And obviously it has a synergistic effect with resistance training in that, you get fitter for your resistance training. And as a result, you can recover better and then you can train harder, right? But obviously there is a tipping point there, and you're more likely to reach that tipping point if you are in a calorie deficit and you don't have that like surplus of recovery or recoverability, whatever you want to call it, right? So it definitely does make sense in my mind to include a little bit of both. However, I probably err a little bit more on the, we'll say, lower volume of higher intensity stuff. And obviously you kind of are as well. And what I generally do is I just do it after resistance training, right? Now that, for some people, they're like, I like to have it away from my resistance training. I like to have it on separate days. I like to do XYZ. For me, I'm like, I would rather you have fuller days of recovery, right? Let's say we're training, resistance training 3 days per week. I'm like, let's actually just put a little bit of cardiovascular conditioning, like higher intensity stuff at the end of those 3 days. So you still have the 4 days off per week. You're not doing an extra session of just interval training. Now, there's an argument to be made, and I would think you would probably make this argument that your training intensity, your ability to push on those sessions is reduced as a result of that, right? Because you're not going in fresh, you're not like being able to push on that. But I'm kind of like, that's what I'm baking into the system. That's what I'm kind of putting in there as a restriction, so that you're not actually pushing excessively hard, so that you are actually able to recover from this. Like, it's not a really hard conditioning session that, like, you go on something like the Rogue Echo bike or any assault bike, really, and it's like, oh no, you're actually torched for the next few days, right? I'm like, I don't want that to be the case. I don't want that to be the limiting factor. So I'm going to put the cardiovascular training at the end of the training session, so there's already that little bit of I'm not able to push as hard on this. And then I also do stuff like you were mentioning there. I usually have like a rest to work ratio of like 3 to 5 to 1. So we are getting a good bit of rest in there. And it's not a case of what people generally think of as like high intensity interval training. They're like, oh, well, that means like, Tabatas or, they're just like, oh, I do 30 seconds on, 30 seconds off, and I do that for 20 minutes. It's like, there's no way that's high intensity. Like, you're not able to push that hard for that long. Because what I want to have from a high intensity session is actual high intensity, right? So that actually means that you're going to be pushing hard. You're going to get into levels of intensity, we'll say, that are, quite high. That's what we want. We want high intensity, right? If you're in a session and you're doing 20, 30, 40 minutes of high intensity work and you're like, oh yeah, man, my intensity was high throughout that whole time. It's like, you can look at your heart rate and you can be like, yeah, okay, cool. The first 1 or 2, you started out and you got your heart rate up, but then it kind of dipped down and it stayed down. You might have actually been on like 140 to 150 beats per minute throughout that session. And it's like, that's not high intensity. You were doing like low intensity there. Your heart rate was at like 140, and this does actually happen quite often and people don't realize it. And it's like, you actually did less work because your average heart rate was at that, because you were taking rest periods. Whereas if you had just kept your heart rate at 140 and done a lower intensity session, you probably would have burned more calories, right? But that's a discussion we'll have in a second, right? So for me, I'm like, I actually just like to have some high intensity training at the end of a session, and rather than doing like 5 to 10 sprints or something like that, I'm like, I'm actually going to keep this at like 3 to 5. It's like, it's a lower amount, and it's also at a little bit of a lower intensity because it is directly after your resistance training. But for me, as I said, and as you said as well, like, I'm not really looking at the calorie burn from this. I know you're probably going to burn 100, 150 maybe calories from that, depending on the exact, specifics of that, the way I have it set up. So it's like, I know, that's a decent little bit of a calorie flux going on there, but I'm not looking at it from a purely calorie burning perspective, right? And then what I do often like you said there, is like, I like to have another session in there, or at least a weekly target of like, let's do 45 minutes to 60 minutes of lower intensity stuff. Again, I might give a beats per minute target for that. It might be like 130 to 150. It might be, for some people, it might be like, actually, I want you to go a little bit higher on this, or a little bit lower, or like whatever it is. Again, specific to the individual, right? And in my mind, I'm like, that's a nice little program there, because you're getting the benefits of both the higher intensity stuff, and then you're also getting the benefits of the lower intensity stuff, right? The main deciding factor in this stuff, it kind of comes down to what the specific goal is. And for us, a lot of our clients, the specific goal is they want to be healthy, fit, athletic, we'll say, while also achieving their body composition and, you know, performance goals and health goals or whatever. So for us, I'm like, we kind of need to hit everything. Now, obviously, again, like if people are coming to us with very specific goals, we're not giving this like shotgun approach, right? But if someone's like, I want to just generally feel better, I want to be fitter, I want to do XYZ, I'm like, I want to hit as many targets as we can while still maximizing the actual results that we get from those. So it's not just a pure scattergun approach. It's like we're actually getting a measurable benefit from each of these things that we bring in. We're not bringing it in such a low dose that it's not effective, right? So time efficiency has to play into this. And for a lot of people, the higher intensity stuff is going to be more time efficient. However, as I said earlier on, that actually presupposes that you are doing high intensity training, right? Like it's not time efficient to do low intensity training and pretend it's high intensity training, right? Like it doesn't make sense. You're not actually getting the benefit that you think you are, right?